Written to research royal-scriptplaybook.md. Invented palace drama. Conversational, narrator. Legal gate own, hedged register, no crime. Camilla has a wound, not a rap sheet. Anne wholly sympathetic. William protected, not snubbed. Real anchor facts are genuinely public and clustered in Act 4. Anne is a Councillor of State. The Councillors of State Act 2022 actually added Anne and Edward, DEC 2022. The Regency Act 1937 is real. Charles's health treatment is public. The regent title and the private scenes are the dramatized layer, flagged as accounts. Object A equals the signed instrument. Object B equals a handwritten note clipped to it. Target, so 4,900 words, /h blux 32 minin, for a 150 WPM. Verdict sentence, 1 Fentry motive denial sentence 2 mechanism withheld. Object A, no. So King Charles signed a single document, and instead of handing it to his wife, or to his heir, he handed it to his sister, and by the time anyone in that room fully understood what it meant, Princess Anne already held an authority nobody had seen coming. This wasn't a snub to William. It wasn't Charles picking a favorite, and it wasn't some sudden family feud spilling over. Those are the loud explanations, and every one of them gets it backwards. It was one page, one sealed instrument, set out on a leather-topped desk, and a short line written by the king's own hand and clipped to the front of it. And when the meaning of that page finally landed, reportedly a beat or two after it was handed over, it did something no announcement ever could. It quietly rearranged who this family leans on when it can't lean on the king. We're going to walk through all of it, what the document actually did, why Anne, of everyone, and the one handwritten line that, household accounts say, left the room silent. Ou calm. Establish how Charles works, plus Anne's real standing. To understand how one page could do that, you have to understand two things: how Charles actually operates when something matters, and who Anne actually is inside this family. Because the public picture of both is a little off. Charles, by most accounts of people who've worked near him, is not an impulsive man in private, whatever the headlines suggest. He is careful, he drafts, he thinks in decades, not news cycles. It's the one habit his entire upbringing drilled into him. So when the story goes that he made a surprise decision, understand that the surprise was in the choice, never in the process. This would have been considered, and reconsidered, and slept on, long before any pen touched any paper. And Anne, here's what the public tends to miss. For years, by simple engagement count, she has been at or near the top of the hardest-working members of the entire royal family. Hundreds of official duties a year, decade after decade, with almost none of the drama that follows the others. No memoir, no feud she chose. No headline she went looking for, just the work. She is, in the plainest sense, the family's safe pair of hands, the one who shows up, the one who, people who know them say, Charles has trusted his whole life in a way he trusts almost no one else, because she wants nothing from him. She isn't waiting for the throne. She isn't managing her image. She just does the job and goes home. Now hold those two facts side by side. A king who never decides anything quickly, and a sister who has spent 50 years being the person you can actually rely on. Put them in a quiet study with one sealed document between them, and the surprise starts to look less like a shock, and more like the most obvious decision Charles ever made. It only shocked the people who'd never been paying attention to Anne. What's at stake? Name the wound to come. But here's why a quiet, obvious decision became something the whole family had to reckon with. Any document that names one person as the one you lean on is, by its very nature, a document that leaves someone else standing to the side. That's not cruelty. That's just what choosing is. Every time you name a deputy, you unname everyone you didn't. And in this family, the person with the most to lose from a decision she couldn't see, couldn't shape, and couldn't argue with, was Camilla. I want to be fair to her here, because the easy version of this story turns her into a villain, and the honest version doesn't. Camilla is the queen. She stood beside Charles through decades most marriages would not have survived. Public fury, private grief, years of being treated by half the country as the thing that went wrong. Whatever you think of how that began, she earned her place through sheer endurance, and people who know her say the fear that place could still be quietly diminished never fully left her. So when word reached her that there was a new instrument, and that it had gone to Anne, and not to her, she didn't hear a sensible administrative choice. She heard something older and much more personal. She heard, "You are not the one they reach for." Real, checkable facts cluster here. The dramatized layer flagged, Object A framed. Let me put the pieces we can actually stand on down first, because this is the part people skip, and it's the part that gives the whole story weight. Start with something real and checkable that almost nobody outside the constitutional world knows. Princess Anne is a counselor of state. That is not a dramatization. It is a genuine constitutional role. Counselors of state are the senior royals legally allowed to step in and carry out the sovereign's official duties when the king can't. Sign routine documents, hold privy council meetings, receive ambassadors. It is, in plain terms, the mechanism by which someone else can act for the monarch. Now the part that matters even more, and it's also fact. In December 2022, Parliament passed the Councillors of State Act, and that act specifically added Princess Anne and Prince Edward to the list. This actually happened. Charles asked for it, early in his reign, and the reason given was blunt and practical. He wanted working, reliable, present royals in that role, people who actually do the duties, rather than names who, for various reasons, no longer could. In other words, on the public record, at the very start of his reign, Charles moved to put his sister closer to the machinery of acting for the crown. That is real. And one more fact, because it sits underneath everything. Charles's health has been a matter of public record. He has undergone treatment. The palace has said as much openly. A king thinking hard about who steps in when he cannot is not a plot device. It is, given the last couple of years, simply prudent. Everything from here is where we cross from the record into the accounts. The regent instrument itself, the study, the handwritten line, and I'll flag it clearly, because none of that has been confirmed by anyone official. What the accounts describe is a single sealed document, prepared quietly, that went beyond the routine Councillor of State arrangement. An instrument that named Anne, specifically, as the one Charles wanted at the center of things during any period he had to step back. Not a change to the line of succession, nothing to do with the throne. William remains the heir, full stop. This was about the in-between. The who holds the steering wheel when the king's hands come off it, and about making sure that person was the steadiest one in the family. That's Object 1, a sealed instrument on a desk, one name inside it, and a line clipped to the front. Hold on to it, because that clipped-on line is Object 2, and it's the reason the room went quiet. Camilla's human reason. No crime. Before we get to what that line said, stay with Camilla for a second, because if you don't understand what she was actually afraid of, the rest of this just looks like wounded pride, and it wasn't. Reportedly, in the days around all this, Camilla was unusually quiet. Not the sharp kind of quiet, the other kind. The kind people who have spent a long time braced for rejection recognize in each other. Because here's what she understood that maybe no one else in that study fully did. A title can be shared. A duty can be split. But a document that names one specific person as the one the king reaches for, that isn't a role you can be gently included in later. It's a ranking, written down, in the one hand that outranks everyone. And she had spent her entire royal life terrified of exactly that, of finding out, in writing, that when it truly counted, she was not the one they'd choose. And this was never really about Anne at all. That's the reframe most people miss. Camilla wasn't threatened by a more dutiful woman. She's worked beside Anne for decades without a flicker of rivalry. What frightened her was the sentence underneath the choice. The quiet verdict that when the family had to pick the person they trusted with the king himself, they hadn't picked the wife, they'd picked the sister. So when she heard about the instrument, those close to the household say she didn't ask what it granted. She asked something quieter, and much sadder. She asked whether Charles had written it alone. Object A hands to Object B, the note. He had. And that's where the second object comes in. Because clipped to the front of that sealed instrument, the accounts say, was a note. Not typed, not drafted by a private secretary, a short line in Charles's own handwriting, the kind of thing a man writes when he wants the meaning to be unmistakably his, and not the household's. No one who's described it claims to have the exact wording locked down, and versions differ slightly, which is honestly what you'd expect from something passed hand to hand. But they agree on the shape of it. It wasn't an order. It wasn't legalese. It was, of all things, a reason. Charles had written down. Why? Why Anne? Why now? In a single sentence, so that whoever opened that document would understand the choice was not a slight against anyone, but a decision about steadiness. And the reason he gave, the story goes, reached all the way back to their mother. Because think about what Anne actually represents to Charles. She is the last person alive who remembers the same childhood he does. The same corridors, the same expectations, the same mother. Not Queen Elizabeth the institution, but the actual woman at the actual breakfast table. When Charles reaches for Anne, he isn't just reaching for a competent deputy. He's reaching for the one person who understands, from the inside, what the job costs and what the family is for. That's not something a title confers. It's something only a sibling who lived it can carry. Now, I want to keep us honest, because this is exactly the sort of detail that grows in the retelling. We do not have the palace confirming a handwritten note. We have people around that world describing one, consistently, and describing the same effect it had. Treat it as an account, not a receipt. But take the shape of it seriously, because the shape is the entire point. This wasn't a grab for power. It was a king, thinking about the days he might not be able to hold the wheel, choosing the one hand he trusted to hold it steady, until William's time came, and writing down, in his own hand, that that was all it ever was. Which brings us to the question the whole room was actually holding. Not, what does the document grant? Because they'd know that in a moment. The real question was quieter, and it cut deeper. If Charles had thought this carefully about the in-between, about who steps in when he steps back, then he had also, clearly, been thinking about a day when he wouldn't be there to explain himself. And that is a thing no family wants to sit in a room and openly acknowledge about the person at the head of the table. That, reportedly, is the thought that made the study go still, and it's the one Anne answered. Pushback, then, worse than that, stack, one reframe. Now, before Anne said anything, there was pushback. There always is, and it usually arrives dressed as concern for the rules. And the objection was a fair one. Elevating Anne, specifically, over the ordinary arrangement risks looking like the king is reaching past his own heir. William is the future. To hand his aunt a central, named authority, even a purely stand-in one, even one that has nothing to do with succession, could read, to an outside world that loves a rift, as Charles quietly signaling he trusts his sister more than the man who'll actually wear the crown. That's a genuine risk. Monarchies live and die on perception, and perception doesn't read footnotes. That's the counter-argument, and it's the strong one. If you were arguing against the instrument, that's exactly where you'd plant your flag. This creates a story we can't control. Except here's where it gets worse for that argument, not better. Because the whole objection assumes William would be threatened by it, and by every account he wasn't. William, reportedly, understood the point immediately, maybe faster than anyone else in the room. He is the heir. He is also a father of 3 young children, with a wife who has been through a serious illness, and a man who has said, in his own way, that he wants to do things differently, more sustainably, less consumed by the machine. A steady, trusted deputy at the center of things isn't a threat to William. It's a gift to him. It's the difference between inheriting a functioning family and inheriting a crisis. Anne holding the wheel in the in-between means William doesn't have to drop everything, every time, to hold it himself. And it gets worse for the objection than that. Because the alternative to naming Anne wasn't name no one. There's always someone. If not the steadiest working royal in the family, then who? The arrangement doesn't get to be empty. Every name you might put there instead carries more risk, not less, more image to manage, more agenda to wonder about, more chance the in-between becomes a contest. Anne is the one choice that nobody could plausibly accuse of wanting it for herself. Her total lack of ambition for the throne is precisely what makes her safe to trust with the king. The thing that kept her out of the spotlight her whole life is the exact thing that qualifies her now. And it gets worse still. Because to argue against Anne, you'd have to argue that 50 years of quiet, drama-free, relentless service should count for less than the optics of a headline that might never even run. You'd have to tell the hardest working member of the family that the reward for never once making it about herself is to be passed over the one time it actually matters. This is a family that has spent the last 2 years telling the country, in every tribute to the late Queen, that duty and steadiness are the whole point of the institution. You cannot preach that for 2 years and then, in a private study, decide it doesn't apply to the one person who has actually lived it. So the room reached the place these things always reach. Someone, reportedly, said the quiet part plainly. If we don't back this, we are telling Anne, and everyone watching how this family really works, that service without self-interest earns you nothing when the trust is handed out. Nobody wanted to be the person who said that out loud, because there's no good way to say it. And that's the moment Anne finally spoke. The scene. Concrete, sensory, hedged, humanized. Anne's response plus the reason. I've told most of this in the language of accounts, and I'll keep doing that, because that's what it is. But the people who've described what happened in that study describe it in strikingly similar terms, and after a while the sameness starts to carry its own weight. So here's the scene, told the way it's been told, and you can weigh it yourself. It's a private study, late afternoon by the accounts, that low, honest light that comes in at the end of a long day. The sealed instrument is on the desk, the handwritten note still clipped to the front. Charles is there, William is there, and Camilla, reportedly, is standing a little apart from the desk, near the window, the way people stand when they're in a room but not sure they're still part of what's happening in it. And Anne, the story goes, had not touched the document. That's the detail everyone keeps, and it tells you everything about her. The one person in the room the page actually elevated was the one person who hadn't reached for it. She let it sit there. She waited. Because Anne, by every account of how she operates, does not grab. She has spent a lifetime watching other people in this family lunge at things, and she has made a quiet religion out of being the one who doesn't. When she finally moved, the accounts say, she didn't go to the desk, she went to Camilla. Now understand what that means, because it's the opposite of what a person consolidating power does. The instrument was hers. The moment was hers. If Anne wanted to seal the win, she'd have picked up the page. Instead, she crossed the room to the one person that page had quietly wounded, and she stopped a careful distance away. Not close enough to corner her. not far enough to be speaking past her. And she said, by more than one account, in nearly the same words, something nobody expected. She didn't talk about the document. She didn't defend the choice. She said, quietly, that she hadn't asked for it, and that she didn't want it the way Camilla feared she wanted it. And then she said the line that ended the argument. I'll give it to you the way it's been passed along, and then I'll be honest about what we can and can't know. The line, reportedly, was this. He didn't choose me over you. He chose the day he won't be here to choose at all. And on that day, I will need you in the room, not behind me, beside me. Now, did Anne say exactly that, word for word, in a private study with no recording? We cannot know that, and I won't pretend otherwise. What I can tell you is that everyone who has described this moment describes a version of that sentence, and describes the same thing happening in the room after it. Because whatever the exact words, look at what the line actually does. It takes the entire story Camilla had been telling herself, that this was a ranking, a verdict, the family finally choosing the sister over the wife, and it turns it completely inside out. It reframes the whole document. The instrument was never about who Charles trusts most. It was about a day none of them wanted to name, and about making sure that when it came, the family didn't fracture into a contest. And in that version, Camilla isn't the one left outside. She's the one Anne is openly saying she'll need. Not a rival to be managed, a partner to be relied on the worst day the family will ever have. That's a very different thing from winning. Anne didn't cross the room to defeat Camilla. She crossed it to recruit her. And here's the part that, when a version of it reached beyond that study, did something to everyone who heard it. Because it wasn't the document that stunned people. Documents are just paper. It was the reason underneath it. A king quietly planning for his own absence, and a sister who, handed real authority, immediately used her first words not to claim it, but to reach for the wife everyone assumed she'd just beaten. That is not how power usually behaves in this family, or in any family. And people, hearing it, found themselves thinking less about crowns and constitutions and more about their own families, about who, in a real crisis, actually turns to help the person standing by the window, instead of stepping over them to take the desk. Charles, by the accounts, said almost nothing through all of this. That fits him. He is not a man who fills a silence to feel in control of it, but the people who describe the scene describe him watching his sister cross that room, and watching what she chose to do with the very first moment of the authority he'd just handed her, and understanding, maybe more completely than he had when he signed it, that he'd chosen exactly right. Because the instrument didn't prove Anne could be trusted with the crown's machinery. Anyone competent could run the machinery. What she did in that room proved she could be trusted with the family. Which is the harder thing, and the one no document can grant. The page stayed on the desk, the handwritten line stayed clipped to the front, and the authority it carried settled, quietly, onto the one set of shoulders in that family that had never once asked to carry it, and, in her first act of holding it, had turned immediately to share the weight with the person everyone expected her to leave behind. Do not milk it. So here's where it landed, and I'll keep it short, because the family kept it short too. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no new title read out from a balcony, no press release headlined, Regent. If you were waiting for a public moment, there wasn't one. And that absence is the whole point. The instrument was quietly kept in force. The arrangement stood. And the family did the thing it does best when it actually agrees on something. Absolutely nothing. In public. At all. Because the decision had already been made. Carefully, deliberately, by a king who never does anything quickly. And everyone else in that study, for all the pushback, was just catching up to a choice that had been sitting sealed on a desk the whole time. Camilla kept her title, kept her place, kept everything the public can see. What changed wasn't her standing. It was something quieter, the discovery of where, exactly, she stood when the family finally looked ahead to its hardest day. And the answer, it turned out, was beside Anne, not behind her. Lasting consequences. Rehooks. But a decision like that doesn't just close. It leaves a shape behind, and the shape is what actually changed the family in the weeks after. Because everyone in that study walked out knowing something they hadn't known that morning, and it wasn't about a document. It was that Charles had been quietly planning for his own absence, in writing, with the kind of care that tells you he'd thought about it far more than he'd ever let on. And once a family knows the king has been thinking that way, the whole mood shifts, not into panic, into something more tender and more watchful. People being a little kinder to each other, a little slower to fight over small things. The way families are when they've all quietly understood that the person at the head of the table won't always be there. Anne, by the accounts, changed the least, which is the most Anne thing imaginable. She didn't step into the light. She didn't start behaving like someone who'd been elevated. She did what she always does, more of the work, with less of the fuss, as if the document had simply formalized something she'd already been doing for years, because it had. William, reportedly, grew closer to his aunt after this, not the ceremonial closeness of shared engagements, but the real kind, the kind you only get from someone who has quietly made your future easier and asked for nothing in return. He understood what she'd taken off his shoulders. An heir who knows there's a steady hand ready for the in-between is an heir who gets to be a father a little longer before he has to be a king. And Camilla. Here's the part that keeps this from being a story about someone getting put in her place, because that's not what the accounts describe, and it's not what happened. In the weeks after, household sources say she was different, not diminished, steadier, oddly. Someone who had spent a very long time braced for a verdict that, when it finally came, turned out not to be a verdict at all, turned out, in fact, to include her, in the one moment she'd been most sure it would leave her out. Because that's the thing about a lifetime of bracing for rejection. When the rejection doesn't come, when the person you were sure had just beaten you turns around and says, "I'll need you beside me." It doesn't feel like losing. Those who know her say it felt like being let in. Finally. All the way. The institution didn't crack that afternoon. It did something quieter and far rarer. It looked directly at its own hardest day, the one every monarchy eventually faces, and instead of splintering over who'd hold the power, it decided, in one sealed page and one handwritten line, to face that day together. Object B pays off. Which brings us back to the note. The handwritten line clipped to the front of the page. Because that line is the whole story in miniature, isn't it? Charles could have let the document speak for itself. Instruments don't need reasons attached. That's what makes them instruments. The safe, kingly move is to sign, seal, and say nothing. He didn't. He wrote down. Why? In his own hand, so that no one, not Camilla, not William, not history, could ever mistake the choice for a slight. He did the one thing the machinery never does. He explained himself. And that, in the end, is the most Elizabeth thing he could have done. Because their mother never announced the things that mattered most either. She wrote them down, quietly, and chose the right person to trust them to, and let time prove her right. Charles signed the page, but it was the handwritten line, the reason, in his own hand, that turned a piece of constitutional housekeeping into the most human decision of his reign. Call back to hook image. Honest caveat. Human note. So that's the story, or as much of it as anyone outside that study has been able to piece together, and I'll be straight with you one last time about what that means. The real checkable part is smaller than the headline. Anne genuinely is a counselor of state. Charles genuinely moved early in his reign to strengthen exactly that role. And a king thinking hard about who steps in for him is, given the last couple of years, simply sensible. The sealed instrument, the study, the handwritten line, those come from accounts, from people who move in and around that world, not from anything the palace has confirmed. Believe the parts you want to, doubt the rest. That's the honest deal. But here's why it's worth telling, even with the caveats. Because strip away the document and the drama, and what you're left with is a very simple, very human thing. A man who has spent his whole life being told exactly who he's supposed to trust, the wife, the heir, the institution, quietly decided that the person he most needed for the hardest day ahead was the one who had never asked him for anything at all. His sister. The one who was there at the same breakfast table, under the same mother, learning the same lesson, that the work is the point, and the fuss is not. And she took that trust, and, in the very first moment she held it, used it to reach for the person everyone assumed she'd just left behind. There's something almost quiet-hearted in that, when you sit with it. In a family whose fractures usually play out in memoirs and interviews and cold silences, one sealed page and one handwritten line did the opposite. They pulled the family a little closer to face the thing families most want to look away from. The room was one decision heavier that afternoon, but the choice was made, and written down, and understood, and the hand chosen to hold the wheel in the in-between was the steadiest one in the family, exactly as their mother would have wanted. That's the reason it stunned the nation. Not that Charles chose Anne, but why he did, and what Anne did with it the moment he had.